The sun sank low over the horizon, spilling molten light across the desert like fire over an endless sea of sand. Margaret Cole, a weathered cowgirl with a wide-brimmed hat pulled low over her brow, rode slowly on her bay horse Dusty. The day had been long, the trail unforgiving, and loneliness gnawed at her bones. She had crossed mesas, arroyos, and dry riverbeds, searching for a passage that would spare her cattle from the worst of the drought. Yet something tugged at her heart, as if the land itself was whispering secrets, daring her to notice what others had forgotten. Dusty suddenly snorted, ears pricking forward, and tugged the reins toward a jagged ridge of hills that cut the desert floor like broken teeth. Margaret frowned. Few riders ventured there, too many rumors, too many tales of men who went in and never returned. She tightened her grip on the reins, ready to steer him back to the open trail, but then she paused. The horse seemed insistent, not spooked, but drawn. "All right, boy," she murmured. "I'll trust your judgment." She let him lead, though unease rippled through her. The ridge looked like the kind of place that remembered blood. As they neared the base of the ridge, the air cooled. A faint smell of dampness drifted on the wind, strangely out of place in the arid desert. Margaret dismounted, her boots crunching over loose stones, and led Dusty by the reins. Her eyes scanned the hillside, and there, half hidden beneath brush and boulders, she spotted a sagging wooden frame, weathered black with age, a mine entrance, or what was left of one. She froze, her breath catching. Old stories rushed back, a silver vein richer than any other, but cursed. Men had died digging too deep, their greed swallowed by darkness. Margaret crouched near the entrance. Splintered beams, rotted and twisted, leaned precariously, struggling to hold the earth at bay. Rusted lantern parts and a broken pickaxe lay scattered in the dirt. She touched the cool metal and felt the weight of forgotten lives pressing in. Someone had worked here once, chasing dreams of fortune. Someone had abandoned it too. The silence felt heavy, like a warning, yet Margaret's curiosity burned hotter than her fear. She unhooked the lantern from her saddlebag, struck a match, and lit the wick. A soft glow filled the darkness. "Just a quick look," she whispered. The air inside was colder, damp, and thick with the scent of mold and stone. Every step echoed, her spurs ringing softly, mingling with the creaks of wooden supports that seemed ready to give way. She kept one hand on the wall, the other gripping the lantern. Dust motes swirled in the beam of light, and the silence pressed tighter. She wondered if her footsteps were the first to echo here in decades, or if someone else had come before her and never returned. Her pulse quickened, but she forced herself deeper. She was a cowgirl, and cowgirls didn't spook easy. After a short stretch, her lantern caught something glinting in the rock. Margaret leaned closer, brushing away dirt with her fingertips. Gold, thin veins, threaded through the stone like frozen lightning. Her breath hitched. The legends were true. She pried a small chunk loose and held it up to the lantern, marveling at the shimmer. Yet joy was tempered with dread. If this was here, why had the mine been abandoned? Men didn't walk away from fortune without reason. She pocketed the nugget, heart pounding, and pressed onward. Some truths had to be seen with her own eyes, no matter the cost. Deeper inside, she found collapsed timbers, piles of rubble, and tracks where carts had once carried ore. Her light swung across a broken barrel, then froze on something else, a leather satchel wedged beneath a fallen beam. Margaret knelt, tugging it free. Inside lay scraps of parchment, brittle but legible. She squinted at the scrawled words. "The vein runs deep, but the earth groans. Men vanish. I hear voices in the rock." She swallowed hard. Fear crawled up her spine. A mine rich with gold, but cursed with whispers. She stuffed the papers back into the satchel, her hands trembling. A sudden clatter echoed behind her. Margaret whipped around, lantern swinging. Stones tumbled down the shaft, but the shadows seemed to shift. For a heartbeat, she thought she saw movement. A figure, watching from deeper in the dark. Her chest tightened. "Who's there?" she called, voice sharper than she intended. Only silence answered, heavy and suffocating. Dusty whinnied faintly from outside, his call muffled by the earth. Margaret forced a breath. "Just rats," she told herself, though her gut screamed otherwise. She tightened her grip on the lantern and pressed forward, stubbornness stronger than fear. The mine wasn't done with her yet. The passage narrowed, walls pressing in. She ducked beneath a low beam and found herself in a chamber littered with rotted crates. One lay cracked open, revealing cloth bags stacked within. Margaret tugged one free, and the weight nearly toppled her. Gold dust spilled from a tear in the fabric, shimmering in the lantern light like fireflies. Her hands shook as she tied the bag shut. Riches beyond measure, left to rot in the dark. But why? Her lantern flickered, shadows dancing wildly across the walls. A low groan rumbled through the chamber, not from her imagination, but from the earth itself. The ceiling trembled, dust raining down. Margaret bolted for the entrance, clutching the bag. Behind her, wood cracked like gunfire, beams collapsing in a chain reaction. She sprinted, lungs burning, the lantern swinging wildly. Stones clattered against her shoulders. She dove through the narrow gap at the entrance just as the passage behind her caved in with a thunderous crash. Dusty reared, eyes wide. Margaret rolled to her feet, chest heaving. The mine sealed itself shut, as if the earth had swallowed its secrets once more. She clutched the bag of gold to her chest, torn between triumph and dread. Moonlight bathed the ridge in silver, stark against the ruin she'd escaped. Margaret tied the bag to her saddle, her fingers trembling. She pulled the papers from the satchel and studied them under the pale glow. The miner's words swam before her eyes. The earth groans. Men vanish. She shivered. This wasn't just a lost fortune, it was a warning. Dusty pawed the ground, restless, ears flicking at unseen sounds. Margaret tightened the reins. She knew the desert was full of stories of curses and buried treasure, but she had never expected to walk into one. And now it was hers. She mounted Dusty and guided him away from the ridge. The night stretched vast and silent, broken only by the horse's steady hooves and her own racing heartbeat. Margaret couldn't shake the feeling of eyes on her, though the desert seemed empty. She replayed the shadow she thought she had seen in the mine. Was it only her imagination, or something left behind in the dark? The bag of gold weighed heavy against her thigh. She whispered into the night, "What have I done?" The wind carried no answer, only the rustle of sand and the faint cry of coyotes. Hours later, she stopped to rest by a dry creek bed. Dusty lowered his head to graze what little scrub grew nearby, while Margaret sat on a rock, staring at the bag. Riches enough to change her life, to buy land, cattle, maybe even a future she never dared dream, yet unease gnawed at her. Gold brought greed, and greed brought death. She thought of the miners who had worked themselves into the earth and never returned. Was she any different? Or had she just taken the first step into the same trap? She clenched her fists, torn between wonder and fear. She opened the satchel again, pulling out the miner's journal. Flipping through the fragile pages, she found crude maps sketched in the margins, tunnels winding deeper, annotations warning of collapses and strange noises. One line caught her breath. "We sealed the lower shaft. What we found should never be unearthed." Her hands shook. What had they seen? What had they feared so much they abandoned fortune itself? Margaret closed the journal, clutching it tight. She had proof of the mine's existence, proof of its curse. The question now wasn't whether she believed, it was whether she had the strength to turn away. The night stretched on, stars cold and brilliant above her. Margaret leaned against Dusty's warm flank, listening to his steady breathing. She thought of the townsfolk she might return to, the disbelief in their eyes when she showed them gold. They would want more. they would demand to know where it came from. And if she told them, the mine would be swarmed, its curse awakened. If she stayed silent, she carried the burden alone. Either way, she was no longer just a cowgirl wandering the desert. She was keeper of a secret that could shape destinies or destroy them. Sleep came fitful, filled with dreams of collapsing tunnels and unseen whispers in the dark. When dawn broke, Margaret stirred, exhausted but resolute. The gold gleamed in the light, mocking her uncertainty. She strapped the satchel securely to the saddle. Dusty whinnied softly, as if sensing her conflict. "We'll figure it out," she murmured, stroking his mane. The desert stretched wide before them, endless and merciless, but somewhere beyond lay choices she couldn't avoid. She kicked Dusty into motion, riding toward the rising sun, carrying both a treasure and a curse that would change her life forever. As the hours passed, Margaret weighed her options. Should she hide the gold, spend it quietly, bit by bit, without drawing attention? Or should she sell it openly and face the questions, the greed it would ignite? Her heart leaned towards secrecy. The mine had sealed itself behind her, as though it demanded its riches remain buried. She thought of the miner's words, of voices in the rock. Some doors were better left closed. Yet her fingers tightened on the reins. A piece of her still longed to return, to dig deeper, to uncover what the earth had tried to hide. By midday, heat shimmered across the plains. Margaret stopped beneath a lone mesquite tree, wiping sweat from her brow. Dusty stood patiently, flicking his tail against flies. She drank from her canteen, but the water tasted flat, unsatisfying. Her thoughts drifted back to the cool dampness of the mine, the glitter of gold in the lamplight, the echo of groaning earth. It felt like another world, one she had stepped into and barely escaped. And yet, part of her wanted to go back, not for the gold, but for the truth. What had the miners sealed away? What was still waiting? Margaret shook her head, trying to banish the thoughts. She was a cowgirl, not a prospector. Her life was the open trail, the cattle, the wind in her hair, not dark tunnels and cursed riches. And yet fate had chosen her. She had stumbled upon something that others had died for. She could not undo what she had seen. With a sigh, she tightened her saddle straps and mounted Dusty again. The desert stretched before her like a blank page, but the story had already been written. She carried it with her, heavy and undeniable. The West did not give gifts freely. As twilight returned, Margaret reached a ridge overlooking the vast plains. She halted Dusty, watching the sun bleed into the horizon. In her saddlebags rested gold enough to tempt saints and ruin sinners. In her mind echoed warnings, scrawled by hands long turned to dust. She knew the choice before her was no simple one. Share the secret and unleash chaos, or guard it in silence and carry the weight alone. The desert wind whispered through the cacti, carrying no answers. Margaret straightened in the saddle, resolve hardening. Whatever lay ahead, her life would never again be ordinary. The days that followed were restless. Margaret carried the gold and the miner's journal with her, but she felt as if the desert itself had branded her with a secret too heavy to bear. Every time she rode into a town for supplies, her eyes darted toward strangers, fearful they could see the truth in her saddlebag. At night, when she lay under the stars, she heard again the faint groan of stone and the whisper of unseen voices. She knew the mine hadn't finished with her. It tugged at her mind like a thorn that couldn't be pulled free. She tried to focus on her cattle, her land, the everyday chores of survival, but her hands often froze mid-task, mind drifting back to the ridge. She would see again the glint of gold dust spilling through her fingers, the satchel heavy with riches, and the shadow that flickered deep inside the tunnel. The mine was more than a hole in the earth. It was a question, and questions demanded answers. Margaret feared she already knew what her answer would be. Sooner or later, she would return, no matter the cost. One dawn, She saddled Dusty without explanation, even to herself. She told the hands in town she was scouting grazing land, but her heart knew otherwise. Her horse sensed it too, trotting eagerly toward the ridge, as if he remembered the path. The land grew more barren as they drew near, silence heavier. When the collapsed entrance came into sight, Margaret's throat tightened. The mine waited, buried yet not gone, like a secret daring her to dig it up. She tied Dusty to a juniper tree and stood before the fallen beams, her lantern in hand, her courage trembling. The debris looked impenetrable, but determination burned hot in her chest. She fetched a small spade from her saddlebag and began to clear rocks, sweat stinging her eyes. Hours passed, sun climbing higher, until at last she pried open a narrow crawl space. Darkness yawned on the other side, stale air rushing out to meet her. She hesitated, then struck a match and lit the lantern. The flame quivered, throwing wild shadows. Margaret took a breath, whispered a prayer under her breath, and squeezed inside. The mine swallowed her once more, sealing out the desert with a single breath of stone. The deeper she went, the colder the air became. Her lantern cast faint light on the walls, streaked with veins of quartz and ore. She followed the collapsed tunnel until it opened into a side chamber she had missed before. Inside lay a rusted cart, still half filled with rock. She brushed away dirt and gasped. The cart gleamed with raw silver laced through the ore. This wasn't just a gold mine. It had been a fortune of both silver and gold. Margaret's knees went weak. No wonder men had fought to keep it, and no wonder they had been consumed by it. But something felt wrong. The chamber's air was too still, heavy with a presence she couldn't explain. Margaret's lantern flame guttered, flickering wildly, though there was no draft. She set her hand against the wall and felt it vibrate faintly, as though the earth itself was humming. Her breath caught. She thought of the miner's words. The earth groans, voices in the rock. For a moment, she swore she heard whispers rising from the stone, too soft to understand, but enough to make her blood run cold. She clutched the lantern tighter and forced herself deeper, unwilling to flee. Further in, she stumbled upon a second collapsed shaft. Wooden planks had been nailed across it, deliberately sealing it shut. Charcoal scrawls on the boards read, "Do not open." Margaret's heart thudded in her chest. This was the lower shaft mentioned in the journal, the one they had sealed after finding something that terrified them. She knelt, fingers trembling as they brushed the boards. The wood crumbled at her touch, brittle with time. Through the cracks, she felt a rush of cooler air, carrying with it a faint metallic scent that made her stomach turn. Curiosity clawed at her resolve. Margaret lifted her pickaxe, striking at the boards until they gave way with a shuddering crack. Dust billowed, choking her, but she pressed through. The shaft beyond sloped downward, wider than she expected. Her lantern illuminated the path ahead, glistening with veins of ore. She descended slowly, every step echoing. The deeper she went, the more the air seemed alive, vibrating faintly in her chest. She thought of the men who had sealed this place, who had abandoned their fortunes. What could frighten them so much? Margaret swallowed hard, her throat dry, but she kept moving. She needed to know. At the bottom of the shaft, the tunnel widened into a cavern. Stalactites hung like teeth, dripping water into pools that shimmered in the lantern glow. In the center of the chamber stood an altar-like pile of stones. Margaret froze. Human bones were piled there, bleached white with age. Pickaxes, helmets, boots still clung to some of them, abandoned where their owners had fallen. She staggered back, bile rising in her throat. The miners hadn't just vanished. They had died here, entombed in their greed. Her lantern shook in her hands. She whispered into the darkness, "What happened to you?" The silence pressed heavier. Her lantern's light caught movement, something slithering between rocks. Margaret's heart leapt. But when she swung the flame toward it, nothing was there. Only shadows shifting. She forced herself to kneel near one of the skeletons, reaching for a rusted tin box half buried in the dirt. Inside lay scraps of parchment, brittle but clear enough to read. We dug too deep. It woke something in the stone. The voices never stop. Men turn on each other. Blood everywhere. Margaret's hands shook. She shoved the papers back into the box, snapping it shut. She wasn't just trespassing a mine. She was trespassing a grave. The earth groaned suddenly, a low, mournful rumble that vibrated through the cavern. Rocks tumbled from the ceiling, clattering around her. Margaret bolted for the tunnel, lantern swinging wildly. The walls seemed to close in, voices whispering in her ears. She couldn't make out the words, but they begged, taunted, commanded. She stumbled, scrambled to her feet, lungs burning. At last, she burst into the upper tunnel, gasping. She didn't stop until she crawled out into the desert sunlight, collapsing to her knees. Dusty whinnied, tugging at the reins. Margaret pressed her palms to the earth, shaking. The mine had almost kept her. For hours she sat in the sun, trembling, unable to think clearly. The bag of gold she had once prized now felt poisoned. She wanted to throw it away, to bury it where no one would ever find it. But she couldn't. Her hands clung to it, as if bound by chains. She thought of the bones, the words scrawled by dying men, the whispers that had clawed at her mind. The mine was cursed, but it was also real. The riches buried there could change everything for her, for the town, maybe for the whole territory. The choice weighed on her soul. Margaret finally rose, dusting herself off. She mounted Dusty and turned him away from the ridge. "We're done with that place," she muttered, though her heart knew it was a lie. The mine would haunt her dreams, call her back again and again. As they rode, the desert stretched endless before them, sun blazing overhead. Margaret tightened her grip on the reins. She had entered the mine twice and lived. Few could claim the same, but she knew the whispers would follow her. They weren't finished with her. They would never be finished. The lost mine was part of her now. That night she camped beneath the stars, but sleep offered no escape. She dreamed of tunnels collapsing, voices chanting, bones reaching for her. She awoke, drenched in sweat, gripping her revolver, staring into the fire. Dusty stirred, shifting uneasily. Margaret stroked his mane, whispering, "It's all right, boy. I'm here." Yet deep down, she wondered if she really was. Something of her had been left behind in that cavern, among the bones and whispers. She doubted she would ever feel whole again. In the following weeks, she tried to bury herself in work mending fences, branding cattle, riding long trails. Yet every quiet moment was filled with the memory of the mine. She caught herself staring at the satchel of gold, both hating and desiring it. Townsfolk began to notice her distracted air, the exhaustion etched on her face. When asked what troubled her, she only shrugged. How could she explain that she carried not just wealth, but a curse? No one would believe her. And if they did, they'd follow her straight to the ridge, to their doom. She couldn't risk it. Margaret grew more isolated, speaking less, keeping to herself. Dusty became her only confidant, his steady presence grounding her when fear threatened to consume her. She often rode back toward the ridge but stopped short, staring at the hills from a distance. Part of her longed to return, to uncover more. Another part screamed to stay away. She lived in torment, caught between greed and survival, between truth and silence. The desert gave no answers. It only stretched on, vast and indifferent. One evening, as the sun bled red across the sky, Margaret sat by her campfire, and journal in her lap. Not the miner's journal, but her own. She began to write, pouring the truth onto the pages, the gold, the whispers, the bones, the curse. She didn't know if anyone would ever read it, but the words steadied her. Maybe, if she didn't survive, someone else would learn the truth. Maybe they would finally let the mine rest. She closed the book with shaking hands and whispered to the flames, "This isn't my burden alone anymore." The desert night carried her words away. Still, Margaret knew she would return someday. The mine had branded her. Whether to destroy it, seal it, or surrender to its riches, she could not yet say. For now she would ride the open range, guarding her secret, carrying her gold, haunted by whispers no one else could hear. She tightened her hat against the wind, mounted Dusty, and rode into the night. The stars glittered above, cold and endless, bearing silent witness. Behind her the ridge loomed dark, its cursed heart beating deep beneath the stone, waiting for her return. And she knew return she must.